Another conceit in this argument, maybe less conspiratorial than that one, is that too much focus on wealth and material prosperity actually not only makes us unhappy, but makes us unhappy to the point of depression. In all the literature, well-being is defined essentially in mental health terms. Lord Layard's contribution when he was Happiness Tsar was to call on the government to train up 10,000 more therapists to deal with the supposedly rampant levels of depression and unhappiness in society. And unhappiness and depression are often used interchangeably in this debate. The environmentalist and Guardian journalist George Monbiot tells us, as our GDP increases, we become more mentally disturbed. The only plausible response is that the credit crunch is good for your mental health. While happiness is difficult to measure, the numbers of mentally depressed people might look easier to audit, and so it might seem that this is a more valid approach than the one that I ridiculed earlier. But maybe not, because when you actually look at the figures on the numbers of people who are mentally ill, we see they vary from 1 in 6 to 1 in 4 to 1 in 3. There are some wilder claims of an epidemic. In a publication brought out in 2007 called Walking Back to Happiness, which was a charity that was set up to get people to walk more, and then they said that if you walked more, that improved your well-being, and they got a lot of money to do that. But anyway, they stated the numbers suffering from mental illness is rocketing. Major depression is now the biggest psychological disorder in the West. In 15 years, it will be the most common of any illness. Now, I'm rather nervous about this because before I started teaching, I worked in the voluntary sector, I worked in mental health. And I'm concerned about a happiness policy that's in danger of inflating the number of those who are counted as mentally ill. When we're told that things are getting worse, I think we should be aware of some rather broad definitions in terms of mental health. When Hertfordshire Council's magazine for young people on well-being tells us that someone who has few problems is very healthy and is ultra-confident, and they will have an enormous sense of well-being, but in truth, only a handful of people in the whole world feel like that, it almost makes a virtue out of being underconfident and of feeling as though you're not quite well. It's meant to be reassuring, but I'm worried that instead it encourages the young to view themselves through the prism of their own mental health. Over in South Townside, the council, explaining the need for well-being and happiness as a policy priority, says, we have some data on self-reporting anxiety in children and young people, which suggests that it's getting worse. Youngsters are more likely to report feelings of depression. But isn't it a problem that the evidence here of a growing problem of depression is self-reporting, which is not, I would put to you, the same as clinical diagnosis? And it's hardly surprising in that context that the figures go up. I fear that this approach conflates serious clinical depression with spasmodic symptoms of depression. And in the end, it might trivialize serious depressive illness if that is put on a par with what the literature calls the stress and strains of everyday life that makes us miserable and unhappy. In the end, this can encourage people, I would suggest, to pathologize temporary and minor problems of everyday life and to view themselves as fragile and, ironically, less resilient. If well-being is defined in essentially therapeutic and mental health terms, there it seems to me to be another problem, because once officialdom turns a spotlight on our private troubles and our most personal and subjective emotional responses, that inevitably asks people, through policy, to focus on their inner selves. It asks people to become much more self-orientated. And this, I think, can unwittingly encourage a real sense of anxiety, a sort of angst-ridden self-obsession about whether we're happy or not. I can predict, I think, that if happiness continues to be such a focus, that will lead a significant number of the population to talk about themselves in therapeutic terms and to begin to see themselves as not coping, as unhappy, as depressed, as traumatized. John Stuart Mill famously explained that to ask yourself whether you are happy and you cease to be so. And it's possible that to force people to constantly assess their own happiness levels will actually make them dwell on how unhappy they are. I think there's also a danger of transforming the relationship between the state and the individual in a rather negative way. Once politicians or the state or welfare organisations or charities are charged with enhancing well-being, that turns autonomous citizens into, makes autonomous citizens and forces them to adopt the role of, I would say, kind of hapless patients on a couch to be treated. It seems to me that we make autonomous citizens suddenly at the end of an army of experts and professionals charged with instructing us how to be contented. And I think it's in danger of creating an atmosphere of dependence and one which infantilises us. And as our private and personal preoccupations are projected into the public sphere, is there not a danger as well that this gives a green light to the authorities to essentially colonise our emotional lives? It gives unfettered access to officialdom, to our subjectivity, in order to shape and manage our sense of well-being. I constantly worry about the loss of privacy that comes from CCTV and ID cards and the database state and the whole attacks on civil liberties. But it seems to me that the happiness agenda is even more sinister. I think that the politicisation for the quest for self-fulfillment is something which should give us all the jitters. We should remind ourselves of the posters that went up throughout the Soviet Union in the 1950s declaring, quote, "Glory to the great Stalin, the constructor of happiness." Now, I'm not suggesting that David Cameron is Stalin, but he is saying that he wants to be the contemporary constructor of happiness. And it gives me a certain shiver down my spine when he tells the BBC we should be thinking not just of what is good for putting money in people's pockets, but what is good for putting joy in people's hearts. All I can say is, look, I don't want David Cameron or any politician putting joy in my heart or going anywhere near my heart. I think that the idea of this officialdom constructing my joys or policing what goes on in my heart to be something that's rather concerning. It seems that we're no longer about winning the hearts and minds through argument. Now it's almost as though officialdom is acting as emotional therapists and constructing and managing our inner lives, and I think it's manipulative and intrusive. But I want to ask a more fundamental question too. Are we really sure that we want to treat happiness as an aim? While the pursuit of happiness might be a part of the human condition, what happens if happiness becomes a central focus of our lives? If our emphasis is on feeling good and individual self-fulfillment, does that not distract us from thinking about or caring for others and for our communities, or anything or anyone external to ourselves? Surely focusing on our own emotional needs inevitably undermines the values that might be personally discomforting, even if socially valuable. Virtues such as sacrifice, altruism, commitment, hard work, it seems to me, are often antithetical to the individual quest for happiness, but they are necessary for a sense of civic responsibility. In many ways, the happiness agenda seems completely at odds with the themes in the big society. I mean, why bother volunteering to look after the elderly if it doesn't enhance your emotional well-being? Why bother to struggle to better your society or even yourself? Because that can mean denying yourself happiness. Just on an individual level, take, I don't know, a violinist or an athlete. They have to put in hours and hours of grueling practice. They have to put it with agonies. They have to sacrifice being happy in order to accomplish their goals. They're often tortured souls. They're often never happy with their performance, always aspiring to be better. Take the rebels in Libya. If they were to be overly preoccupied with their inner lives and make their self-fulfillment the only thing that they were concerned with, then surely they would not be prepared to make the sacrifices that many of them are. Now, of course, I do understand something, because there's a danger of being crude, and I know that I have been crude in many ways, and you'll take me up for it in a minute. But I do understand that happiness can be an indirect outcome of the pursuit of civic virtues or attempting to be a good violinist or pushing yourself to improve or whatever. But I just want to make the point that it seems obvious to me that you'll only find happiness by searching for something else. And I think that is the true meaning of J.S. Mill's ask yourself whether you're happy and you cease to be so. If you externalize the quest for a purposeful life, that of course can possibly lead to self-fulfillment. But if the focus turns in on the self and happiness is the only end considered, I would suggest that we actually do a disservice to society. And I still want to ask, is happiness a worthy aim at all? Because let's be honest, you can be happy and ignorant. You can be happy because you're ignorant. I'm not sure that bovine contentment is such a worthy goal. To quote J.S. Mill again, it is better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Maybe we should turn it round and think about what is positive about unhappiness. One of the most positive qualities of human beings, it seems to me, is that we want more than what we've got. That we want more than we've got, that we're never happy, that we're not happy with the status quo. Unhappiness and discontent is not necessarily a sign of inherent misery or damage or the need for a therapist, but it might well be a key driver for social progress. Every technological, scientific, medical, and cultural political breakthrough over hundreds of years has been driven by people not satisfied with the world as it is, not happy. Perhaps the lack of contemporary happiness is a healthy response to the state of the real world. Perhaps discontent is an intelligent person's response to the challenges of a recession-torn society. Maybe we should be unhappy with attacks on our civil liberties, with poverty and unemployment, with a political elite whose big new idea seems all to be about sending around a bunch of apparatchiks with clipboard to measure our happiness. Maybe it's worth noting that when happiness entrepreneurs preach happiness, they're actually preaching an essentially conservative message with a small c. You can't change the big things, but what you can do is to change yourself. But I'm afraid no matter how much pixie dust is sprinkled on it or happy-clappy glee is attached to the happiness agenda, in the end, I think there's a danger this is a recipe for contented complacency that tells us we should be happy with our lot. As our pens hover between the fairly chirpy to very disgruntled boxes on the household survey that we're bound to be getting sometime soon, I'd like to demand that we are left alone to tend to our own flourishing and that officialdom stops trying to engineer us all into bliss. To finish, in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, there's a character called the Savage. The Savage rebels against the top-down imposition of contentment by actually demanding the right to be unhappy. To quote the Savage, who is increasingly becoming the hero of the hour, I don't want comfort, I want God. I want poetry, I want real danger, I want freedom, I want goodness, I want sin. I want the right to be unhappy. If there's any of you out there who fancy becoming sinners or savages, then I'd ask you to join me. I think that rather than endorsing the happiness agenda, that we should actually fight for the right to be unhappy. Thank you very much.